I'm not particularly religious, but Yom Kippur is an important holiday for Jews, and I was surprised to receive an invitation to speak at a synagogue last night. Usually at a synagogue, it's the rabbi who makes the speech, and then usually someone asking for donations for some good cause like the synagogue. So I was surprised to be invited, and my first instinct was to decline, and I did decline. I'm not particularly knowledgeable about religion, and no one wants to hear about politics at a church or synagogue. But the synagogue's leader insisted, and so I promised I wouldn't use trigger words like Trump or Clinton or Obama or Trudeau. I was just going to talk about Jews and the world today. That was my instructions, and I said, okay, I can do that. So I want to give you a short version of my speech, and I want you to tell me what you think of it, whether you're Jewish or not, okay? So I started off by praising Canada and saying that other than maybe Israel itself, there is no safer, better, more welcoming place in the world for Jews to live today in 2016. In fact, since the Jews were exiled from the Promised Land thousands of years ago, there may have been no better place or time compared to now in Canada. I mentioned freedom and tolerance and prosperity and political success. I mentioned how easy it is for Jews to succeed in Canada, to assimilate into a mainstream Christian tolerant society. And everyone in the synagogue was feeling pretty good about themselves and their lives. And then I mentioned the ancient city of Palmyra that was recently taken over by the Islamic State terrorists and then liberated. They'll probably take it back again. And I said, Palmyra, take a look at it. I didn't have a picture, but I said, Palmyra, it was once a great and mighty city, but look at it now. Ruins, dust, a prize for terrorist dregs to fight over. And then I mentioned Constantinople, once the largest city in the world, the richest city in the world, the most Christian city in the world. Imagine how wonderful it would have been to live then at its height. But then it was conquered by the Turks. Its Christians were killed and raped, and its mighty Hagia Sophia Church was turned into a mosque. The entire city was renamed Istanbul. And then I mentioned Detroit. From the richest industrial city in America to a burnt-out ghost town in 50 years, this is a picture of their central train station. It is abandoned. 50 years. Oh, and then I mentioned the great city of Malmo, Sweden. 30 years ago, a shipbuilding city. Today, it's half Muslim, with huge no-go zones that I only dared to visit in broad daylight with a bodyguard when I went there this spring. And my point was, to these complacent, content Jews living in suburban Toronto in Thornhill, I said, how long will Toronto be the delightful city, so comfortable and Jew-friendly and prosperous and easy that it is now? How long? How many more years or generations? Will it have a long run like Palmyra or Constantinople? Does it have one more good generation in it like Detroit did in 1950? Is it lights out in just 20 or 30 years like Malmo? Because there's about 350,000 Jews in Canada. It's about 1% of the population. But since 9/11, Canada has decided to double its Muslim population through immigration. Under Stephen Harper and Jason Kenney, 561,000 immigrants have come here from Muslim-majority countries, or about 60,000 per year. And now Justin Trudeau is adding 30,000 to 50,000 Syrian migrants on top of that per year. So now there's about 1.3 million Muslim people living in Canada, and most of them are in the big cities like Montreal and Toronto. And you're starting to see things like Muslims-only housing enclaves. And of course, I recited the of courses. Of course there are wonderful Muslims. Of course there are liberal, democracy-loving, patriotic Muslims. Of course there are Muslims who believe in Canadian values. Of course, of course, of course. But once I got through the of courses, I pointed out that we actually don't distinguish between liberal Muslims and reactionary medieval Muslim bigots. We don't even ask, let alone choose between them. We take in the wolves along with the lambs. It would be like bringing in 30,000 to 50,000 Germans a year in the 1930s and 40s. Hey, good idea, but are you bringing the Nazis over or just the Jewish refugees? Well, today we're bringing both because we're not vetting anyone based on their beliefs. I pointed out at the synagogue last night that according to the impeccably liberal Pew Research Center, 90+% of people from Syria and Jordan and Lebanon and Turkey, well, they're sexist, they're misogynist, they're homophobic, and they're anti-Semitic too. They hate Jews. Syria is pretty much the most anti-Semitic country in the world. And that's where we're bringing over 30 to 50,000 people a year from. So is Thornhill in the Greater Toronto Area, is it still going to be a great place to raise a Jewish family if in the future it's no longer 30% Jewish and 30% Italian as it is now? But what if it's soon 20% Jewish and 20% Italian and 30% Muslim? Say 10 years from now or maybe 20? Depends on who we're bringing over from Syria. But my God, are we bringing over a lot of people from Syria? And I told them about the only scientifically valid poll I've ever seen about Syrian refugees themselves, a sample size of 900, 300 each from Syrian refugee camps in Lebanon, Jordan, and Turkey, administered by the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, so administered by an Arab university. And this poll shows that 31% of Syrian refugees oppose the Allied war against the Islamic State. I say again, 31% of Syrian refugees take the Islamic State's side in the war. And when asked what the greatest threat to the region is, far more Syrian refugees choose America or the Jews than choose Islamist militancy, which is just 10%. So it's 4-1 who think America and the Jews are the problem, not Muslim terrorists. That's who we're bringing over. As if it's not tough enough already, being a Jewish student at a Canadian university with the anti-Israel propaganda promoted by a toxic coalition of Canadian hard-left social justice warriors who are now buttressed by a battalion of Muslim students. I couldn't imagine what it's like to wear a yarmulke or a Jewish star necklace on campus today. Yeah, what's it going to be like in 30 years? I mentioned the statistics published in Le Devoir that show more than 70% of refugees from Syria, they don't speak English or French. And 40% of them don't even have a grade 6 education. How could they possibly get a job in Canada? How could they possibly do anything other than go on welfare, live in ethnic enclaves where they speak Arabic, and recreate those no-go zones of Malmö, Sweden, here in Canada? And I ended my speech at the synagogue last night by saying that despite all the propaganda about Islamophobia, it's hate crimes against Jews that are on the rise by Muslims. But neither the police nor the media much care about that now. I pointed out last night that far from reporting crimes by Muslim migrants, there's a remarkable policy of self-censorship. You can almost guess the identity of Muslim criminals now because they're the cases where the media and the police are so conspicuously silent about the name or photo of the accused, which is normally disclosed in the first sentence of a news or police report. I said last night to the synagogue that Islamophobia, it means fear of Islam. And that fear is increasingly justified, but police and the media had Islamophobia phobia. They are afraid of being called Islamophobes or racists, so they just sit quietly while Canada is being changed. I made these points and a few others last night, and I said one last thing. I said that as a kid in the 1970s, I went to a small Jewish school in the city of Calgary. It was so small, there was only 11 kids in my class. And the principal, the grade 1 teacher there, they were husband and wife, the Eichlers. They had met actually in a concentration camp and got married. And these two taught us about the Holocaust, and we saw the pictures of the bone-thin Jews and heard the stories. And all I could think as a young boy in the 1970s, hearing directly from these Holocaust survivors and reading about the Holocaust, all I could think about was, how could no one see what was coming? In the 1930s, even as late as the early 1940s, how could the Jews not know? How could they not see that their Palmyra was falling, their Constantinople was about to fall? Why did they not get out? Why did they think everything would be fine? It was so obvious, at least after the fact, at least in retrospect. Why could they not see it then? And how can we not see it now? The Holocaust was unthinkable before it happened. Such evil could not be conceived of by most people's imaginations, but it did indeed happen. And so now, well, now that it happened, we know it's conceivable. It's not unthinkable anymore. We think about it. So in a way, a second Holocaust is actually more likely than the first. I said all this, and then I sat down. And then one Jewish baby boomer stood up and pointed at me and said, "It's Yom Kippur, a day of brotherly love, not a day to hear from a racist." That's what happened last night. Well, Yom Kippur is not actually about brotherly love. It means Day of Atonement, Day of Repentance, a day where Jews ask for forgiveness from other people and from God. It's not about kumbaya. I'm not a master of the Old Testament, but brotherly love, that's more of a New Testament kind of thing. The Old Book is more about righteous fury and judgment. At least that's my take on it. And calling someone racist because you disagree with them, that's positively New Age stuff. There's a bit of a kerfuffle at the synagogue, calling the guest speaker a racist. I said nothing in reply. I gave the guy a wink. A number of people came up to me right away and told me they agreed with every word I had said. I decided to stick around to the end to talk to all comers. That baby boomer who insulted me, he apologized. That befits Yom Kippur, don't you think? But I asked him, I said, how is criticizing Islam racist? Islam is a doctrine, an ideology, a belief system. Islam, communism, capitalism, Judaism. How is criticizing any philosophy racist? How is Islam a race? He had no answer, of course, and he left. Another woman came up to me and told me that her synagogue was sponsoring Syrian refugees and that I was being mean. I was fascinated by that because there's well over 1 billion Muslims in the world. They are amongst the richest people in the world, at least their kings and princes are. Here is a picture of Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. And these are air-conditioned tents in Saudi Arabia. Empty, except during the Hajj pilgrimage. 100,000 tents could house 250,000 people easily, 500,000. So why have all of these OPEC billionaire dictatorships not taken a single Muslim refugee from Syria? Over 1 billion Muslims in the world, and yet it falls to Toronto's Jewish synagogues to pay for Syrian Muslim refugees? Really? Anti-Semitism is skyrocketing, even in Canada and the United States. But the Jews of Toronto, or at least these few virtue-signaling, morally preening liberal Jews, Jews who think Yom Kippur is about brotherly love, Jews who think charity is about ignoring Jews in need, but giving to Syrian Muslims, they want to show just how noble they are. I asked this woman, do you know anything about the Syrian family you're sponsoring? Do you know what they believe about women? This woman was a feminist. Do you know what they believe about Jews or even our Canadian democracy? Yeah, she left pretty quickly too. All the fat, happy, complacent Toronto Jews, the ones who look and sound just like me, they were against me. The ones born in Canada, never had a day's hardship in their life, never had a risk or a danger in their life, never faced real anti-Semitism in their life. They were in love with Syrian refugees, or at least the idea of Syrian refugees. None had met one yet. They didn't dispute my facts, the Pew Research polls, the anti-Semitism, the extreme misogyny and homophobia. They just wanted to prove how virtuous they were by taking a position so fashionable that it was against their own interests, and they still believed in it. And they hated that some other Jew dared to point out that it might not be wise, and that their children might not find Toronto or Thornhill quite as pleasant a place to wear a yarmulke or go to synagogue without security guards as we were doing last night. But I met other Jews. I met a Jew from South Africa. I met a Jew from Poland and a Jew from Israel and other Jews with accents I couldn't trace. And every one of them said they agreed with me. And they were glad someone had said these things. These were not the Jews of comfort, born and raised in the peace of Canada. These were the Jews of real life, who had seen oppression either under the former Soviet Union or in foreign countries that broke down into anarchy, or even in Israel, surrounded by terrorists and dictatorships. And there were Jews, 2 of them, who told me that they actually escaped from the Holocaust as children, and they agreed with me. I stayed and I talked and I argued and I debated, and then I left. And I thought of my friend Barbara Kay, who once said to me, "The Jews are like everybody else, except more so. Now that can be a great compliment if you're talking about good things, being scholarly, being ambitious, being entrepreneurial. But it can be a sad thing too. People can be naive, Jews even more so. People can be blind to reality, Jews even more so. People can buy into illusions, can avoid grappling with reality, can make rationalizations and excuses, Jews even more so than most. I saw Jews who simply would not give up their self-image and their self-delusion in the light of the facts. They will take in their Syrian migrants and smile to themselves about how noble they are. And you know, how is that actually any different from the rest of Canadians? Except that with Jews, it's just more so. What do you think? This is not just a story for Jews on Yom Kippur. This is a story for all Canadians. Those who have never felt a day's deprivation or pain or danger, and those who came here from someplace worse to find peace and freedom and now see that we're importing an army of people who don't share Canadian values. What do you think? Whose side of this debate are you on? Send me an email at ezra@therebel.media. I'd like to know. Thanks for watching. Click here to never miss a Rebel update. Want even more of the Rebel? Well, click here to become a premium member.